Our next speaker is someone I first met in the fall of 1994 after I arrived in Claremont, California for graduate school, and at the time he was working at the Claremont Institute. I was just a rube from the Midwest, and he was one of the first people I met at the Institute. I wasn't exactly sure then what a think tank was, but I was in awe of anyone who got paid to think all day. Though he was based in Sacramento, I would see him when he came to visit the home office in Claremont, and we had many fun and interesting conversations, usually over lunch at Walter's or over a drink after work. We probably had too many of those. And two things have stuck with me about that time. One is that I was a nobody and he was important, but he was always friendly and he always took the time to talk to me. The other thing that has stuck with me is his ability, how I was impressed by his ability to see right to the heart of the matter under discussion, whatever the matter was, and how he would clarify it for the rest of us. And I suspect his ability had something to do with the fact that he was a student of the late, great Professor Harold Rood. Professor Rood taught his students to see past the surface of things and look to the heart of things. Well, today he's the president of the American Strategy Group, whose mission is to understand, to see past the surface of things and to understand the strategic threats to the United States. He's also a board member and a senior fellow of the Claremont Institute, where he served as president from 2002 to 2015. And during his 25 years at the Claremont Institute, he directed its Golden State Center in Sacramento, the National Security Project, and he served as publisher of the Claremont Review of Books. He is currently chairman of the Committee on the Present Danger, China, and is a member of the Independent Working Group on Missile Defense. He's the author of Communist China's War Inside America, and his articles have appeared in many places, including, among others, in Primus. He's a regular on the Bill Bennett Show podcast. He was a national security surrogate for Donald Trump at the 2016 Republican National Convention. He is a native Californian, and he's a graduate of Claremont McKenna College. He's going to speak today about America's top national security concern. Please welcome to the podium Brian T. Kennedy.
Thanks, Tim. Well, good afternoon. Thank you for that kind introduction, Tim. Tim is one of those people, as you all know, that it's very easy to be nice to. And you can see almost immediately a person with a great intellect who loves his country. And so when he was a young man, it was easy to be nice to Tim. It was a good investment. It's great to be with all of you today, and it's great to be in the free state of South Dakota. I thought Governor Noem was spectacular. I think she has a real future ahead of her. Now, anything intelligent I may have to say today will no doubt be in part due to my long association with two of Hillsdale College's senior people, my old friend Larry Arnn and Doug Jeffrey, who were my colleagues for so many years at the Claremont Institute. I'm very proud of all they've achieved here at Hillsdale College, and it's great to be with them here as well. As Tim mentioned, I am chairman of the Committee on the Present Danger China. It was begun last year with my friends and colleagues Steve Bannon and Frank Gaffney. Our purpose was to go around the country and to explain to Americans the threat that communist China presents to the United States and the free world. As I say, we do that around the country. When we meet in Washington, D.C., we meet at Hillsdale College's Kirby Center. Let me offer you this afternoon this proposition. We are today in a war, and we run the risk of losing that war. We are losing because too few of us know that we are engaged with an enemy, the Chinese Communist Party, that means to destroy us. To the extent that this war is being fought at all today, it is by one man, President Donald Trump, who has the resolve to stand up to Communist China nearly all alone. The forces of globalism that have dominated the United States for the better part of a half century have blinded America's elites to the threat before us, and that if we do not wake up soon as a nation, we will find ourselves in a position where we are both undefended and unwilling to fight. To be sure, that is a worst-case scenario, and we are Americans, and we're not going to let that happen. But the forces arrayed against us are many. We need to know what we are up against and what steps must be taken to ensure our victory. Let me describe 3 things for you about China and the Chinese Communist Party. First, who they are. Second, what they are capable of. And finally, the war they are waging against us. Our modern understanding of Communist China begins with the Cold War and the strategic belief by Richard Nixon that China could be played against the Soviet Union, a kind of counterweight, what he called the China card. As strategic ideas go, this had many benefits. We wouldn't have to take on the Soviet Union all by ourselves. The PRC was a populous country that bordered the Soviet Union, and that we would both have a similar desire to check the Soviet Union's global ambitions. Even more so since we thought at the time communism was destined for the dustbin of history anyway, and so getting rid of the communist Soviet Union must ultimately lead as well to the end of communism as a guiding force in China. Now, to achieve these ends, we would engage in trade with communist China and help them develop economically and militarily. We would transfer to them our technological know-how and eventually grant China most favored nation status. American industry liked this idea. They saw opportunities economically with a free and open China. As a commercial republic, we here in the United States thought this made perfect sense. And as we all know, the United States won the Cold War, and we believed ourselves the preeminent military power on earth. The attacks on September 11th, caused by terrorists animated by a radical Islamic ideology, reinforced the notion, however vicious that day was, that superpower conflict was a thing of the past. The best strategic and military thinkers in America were engaged now in fighting a war against radical Islam in Iraq and Afghanistan and other places in the Middle East. Grand strategic thinking of the kind necessary to deal with great power conflicts that might happen with Russia or China were largely ignored. The so-called pivot to Asia under President Obama was mostly rhetorical. If it meant anything, it was an effort by American policymakers to justify new ways of degrading our military capabilities vis-a-vis communist China, prioritizing what we've termed endless wars in the Middle East over anything else, and allowing the PRC and the U.S. economies to integrate further, much as they had during the Cold War. There was, you might say, a kind of China dream that, despite their communist ideology and with enough exposure to the United States and the free world, China would become just like us. Economic liberalism would lead to political liberalism, and China's communist dictatorship would eventually fade away. At minimum, Americans thought a China that was open to the United States would focus on economic issues rather than anything that might approach superpower conflict of the kind we had seen with the Soviet Union. Now, U.S. policymakers took it almost as an article of faith that this would happen. Because if they got this wrong, it would be extremely costly. The U.S. had not, over this period of time, built a military that could challenge the PRC's aggression in the Pacific. Namely, they began to build a modern navy, and they constructed military installations in the South China Sea. And the United States had supported the rise of communist China while allowing the export of our manufacturing base to China and elsewhere. Now, I believe history will record that the so-called China card was and will prove to be very costly. Costly because it could only have been played with a great deal of self-deception about the nature of the Chinese Communist Party and the men who were running it. Economic liberalism did not lead to political liberalism, And China's Communist Party, far from fading away, has mastered the governance of 1.4 billion people. How powerful, you might ask, is Chinese military and economic power today? As I say, they have a population of 1.4 billion people. They are governed by a Chinese Communist Party that has 90 million members, and I estimate an additional 300 million Chinese that are deeply invested in the success of the regime. Combined, that is more people than we have in the United States. They may not all believe in every single aspect of what they call socialism with Chinese characteristics, what amounts to an admixture of Maoism, Marxism, and Leninism, that is practiced there today. They may not all believe that, but to believe that they are something other than active supporters of the regime would be wrong. Indeed, communism works very well for the Chinese elite. For this group, it is more akin to a kind of fascism, where they retain effective control of certain property, engage in the kind of public-private partnerships where businesses in China are privately run with active participation by the Chinese government, in effect being run by the Chinese Communist Party. Once a business reaches a certain size in China, they will take on board a small cadre of Chinese Communist Party members who serve as a direct liaison between the business and the government. Now, however inefficient this may sound at first, we are talking about a Chinese Communist Party that operates a massive global intelligence network through their Ministry of State Security. This network does their part, if at all possible, to assist Chinese industry and businesses through industrial espionage, cyber warfare, and economic coercion. This type of state capitalism, or what you might call a kind of neo-mercantilism, has led to the creation of a modern economy that rivals that of the United States. We might like to believe that communism in China, because of its inherent contradictions, cannot be sustained and will lead to the collapse of the regime. And it may well someday. But the Chinese Communist Party has proven extremely capable in building an empire that can govern 1.4 billion people. That required the conquest of a large number of people in China who were not willing to be subjugated. It required the physical mastery of a territory not easily managed given the perennial challenges of flooding, witness what is happening today with the Three Gorges Dam, and other physical limitations. That they have done all this in such a short period of time and in such a ruthless and determined way should give those in America and the West pause. Theirs is an achievement unparalleled in the known history of the world. Today they have a military of 2 million men under arms, including the largest navy in the world. They may not be qualitatively on par with the United States, but it is said that quantity has a quality all its own. In the last 5 years of U.S. naval war games, where the United States is pitted against the People's Liberation Army Navy, now these are U.S. war games where we simulate ourselves conflict between China and the United States. For the last 5 years, during those war games, each and every time, we have not been victorious. These are, of course, our war games. We have our best military minds knowing what we have to work with and what we're up against. They realize that we simply do not have enough ships and munitions to defeat the Chinese Navy absent the use of strategic nuclear weapons, the prospects of which are dire, to say the least. Well, it might be said, at least the Chinese do not have a nuclear arsenal like ours. Here we don't know really what the Chinese actually possess. We know they are capable of building nuclear weapons. We know they have them. We know they're capable of building advanced missiles and rocketry, and that they possess some quantity of them. We know they stole or otherwise obtained advanced U.S. technology when it came to warhead miniaturization and guidance systems. They have had the industrial capacity for the better part of 2 decades to build these in quantities that can challenge the United States. We have also the knowledge for our part that we here in the United States have not tested a nuclear warhead since 1992 and have not built the kind of advanced arsenal that might be required to deter the Communist Chinese. We also know, after all, that the current secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, is an adherent to the beliefs of Mao Zedong, and that both Mao and Deng Xiaoping believed that the United States was a paper tiger, that we had nuclear weapons, but that we weren't going to use them. There was also, on the part of the Chinese, the rather disturbing belief on their part that even if we did use them, we couldn't kill all of them. That's the way a nation at war thinks. As for the PLA's Air Force, they possess and are building today advanced fighter aircraft that rival anything that the United States has built. Again, they may not have the quantity, but that will come with time. As for proficiency in warfighting, that is something likewise that can be acquired. For all of our military superiority, we have not been in actual combat with a peer competitor for a half century. As good as we may be, the history of the world consists of nations who want to be on top, who want to be the best, and they're not going to sit by and let another nation retain that superiority if they can themselves achieve it. If we think that this is not exactly what the People's Liberation Army is seeking today, we are sorely mistaken. Now, I'd like to tell you that the American military understands all this and is prepared to engage and defeat such an enemy. Although there may be some who do still, it is a more widely held view, and not entirely unreasonable, that the U.S. does not want to fight a land war in Asia, does not want to engage the PRC in the Pacific, and does not want to engage in nuclear war. And although we don't want to fight a land war in Asia, neither do we want a military that's incapable of deterring Chinese aggression in the Pacific, such that we'll be unable to defend our interests or that of our allies. Now, let me be clear, we as a nation are not looking for war with Communist China, but unfortunately, Communist China may be looking for war with us. There was a famous book by 2 Chinese colonels of the People's Liberation Army who published a book back in 1999 called Unrestricted Warfare. It has become a popular document for I and my colleagues to point to on the Committee on the Present Danger China. In this book, these 2 colonels believe that war between the U.S. and the PRC is inevitable, and when it occurs, the PRC must be prepared, if they are to win, to engage in whatever means are necessary to achieve victory. Now, they write in the book that the variable means to achieve this include the use of economic warfare, cyber warfare, information warfare, political warfare, terrorism, bio warfare, and the like. This is back in 1999. Their purpose in writing all of this was to shape Chinese policy, of course, on the one hand, but also to lay down a marker for U.S. policymakers that nothing is out of bounds when it comes to relations, military relations, between the PRC and the United States. Hence the title, Unrestricted Warfare. They want to make clear that not only is the PRC capable of waging war, but they are committed to doing whatever it takes to win. Now, the very act of writing such a book was itself an act of information warfare. They believed themselves in writing it that they could shape Pentagon policy planners and try in their own way to discourage them from designing a military that was capable of challenging the PRC. Because they knew if the United States did not build a military capable of challenging the PRC, as in we don't have enough ships, nor enough planes, nor a national missile defense, then we will, just out of necessity, have to make some kind of accommodation with the PRC, whatever that might be. This is what you call strategic planning, and this is what you call statecraft, and the Chinese are very good at it. All of this is to say that America got wrong that China would abandon their communist ideology and have built a nation that now presents a threat to the United States, which leads to the question, what are they capable of? Now, we need look no further than the history of the Chinese Communist Party. Estimates put the number of dead at the hands of the CCP at roughly 100 million, either through war, starvation, or execution. The mass murder committed by the Chinese Communist Party and their Red Guards during the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution alone saw the death of some 70 million people that they believed were necessary to remake China into the country we see today. Now, this itself does not count the forced abortions that resulted from the PRC's one-child policy. That number is put at, conservatively, 500 million children who were murdered. 500 million. For everyone in the high-tech world who often point to China as this example of economic development, that they're able to move so quickly and so effortlessly to develop new industries, I find the contrast with that number of forced abortions horrific. These are not people who share the aspirations of Western civilization. Freedom and the sanctity of human life are not things that they hold dear. They are today perfecting a system of social credit scoring that monitors the social media of their people and grades them based on their support of the regime. There is a chilling effect on the people of China who have seemed to have made a choice to go along and get along with their communist masters, lest they be excluded from whatever benefits they could enjoy from China's push toward economic modernization. And at one level, one can hardly blame them for going along and getting along. We see today the imprisonment of Muslims in Xinjiang province and the lengths to which the regime has gone to segregate 1 to 2 million Uyghurs and put them in concentration camps. One might call them re-education camps, but it is difficult to see what re-education they are actually receiving. When pressed on the subject, the Chinese government will call them vocational training camps. But given the numbers, it is difficult to keep what is going on there secret. The Chinese government, among other atrocities, facilitates the rape and abduction of Uyghur women for use by Chinese soldiers. Even worse, if that were possible, they actively engage in organ harvesting of the Uyghur population and sell their organs both in China and abroad. This has become a multi-billion-dollar industry. It's difficult to know how widespread knowledge of this is within communist China, but it's an amazing incentive to keep your head down and behave yourself and not speak against the regime, lest you too be sent to a re-education camp. This is what politics looks like in a communist nation. How this atrocity of organ harvesting does not occupy the consciousness of every sentient human being is beyond belief. The ability to look the other way could not be illustrated any clearer than the new Disney movie called Mulan. In it, there are several scenes where the backdrop in the movie was, in fact, the same Uyghur detention camps that were hiding in plain sight. An American audience would not know what they were looking at, but a Chinese audience most likely would. The Chinese must have been struck by the wanton disregard American filmmakers had for these Uyghur camps. Wall Street investors, themselves arbiters of all things moral in American society, most especially environmental concerns, seem not to have a problem with the imprisonment of Uyghurs. They seem to have no problem with China's atrocious environmental record as well. Other examples worth noting: in southern Mongolia, the CCP is working to eradicate their native language, lest they be capable of passing on their traditions, folkways, and familial bonds of affection. And in Chinese schools, there are now textbooks with a history of Christianity that distorts what the Bible says and the teachings of Jesus. In the Chinese retelling, Jesus was not only a sinner, but when presented with the passage of the woman who was about to be stoned for adultery, in the Chinese version, it was Jesus who stoned her to death. Dr. Arnn earlier was talking about controlling people's minds. That is what is going on in China. Despite this, Pope Francis will renew his agreement with the Chinese Communist Party to give them effectively control over how the Catholic Church, or what passes for it, operates in China. Now, it's worth noting these levels of depravity and human rights abuses, both because it needs to be said and because it illustrates what they are capable of doing to their own people, and therefore, by extension, what they are capable of doing to other people if they had the opportunity, namely us. Of course, the Chinese Communist Party operates a vast intelligence network in the United States as well. It is made up not merely of Chinese intelligence operatives working for the Ministry of State Security, but they also have, here in this country, 370,000 Chinese students attending American universities. They have Confucius Institutes operating on American campuses. They have the Chinese Students and Scholars Association, and a myriad of business and industry officials, all of them from the students on down, who are subject to the PRC's National Intelligence Law of 2017, specifically Article 7, which requires that any citizen shall support, assist, and cooperate with the state intelligence network. Students in American universities have to report to handlers in Chinese consulates and embassies about who they meet, the research work that they have going on, and give to the Chinese government whatever information is asked for. Quite literally, the National Intelligence Law touches the lives of every single Chinese national that comes to the United States. It's not surprising that a combination of this network and cyber theft could yield 500 to 600 billion a year of intellectual property theft. They also have, operating here in this country, the 1,000 Talents program run by the Chinese Communist Party that seeks to hire the best and brightest Chinese and American professionals to work with growing Chinese industry and scientists. This has been an especially problematic program for the United States. Witness the arrest of Harvard professor Charles Lieber earlier this year for not disclosing his ties to the Chinese government. He was doing some important research for the US government, but it turns out also for the Chinese government. Recently, there was fired in my home state of California a Chinese American who was the CFO of the California Public Employment Retirement System. His name was Yu Ben Ming. He had been responsible for investing CalPERS funds in Chinese corporations tied to the People's Liberation Army and into Chinese companies that he himself was personally invested in. So here is a guy, Chinese national, moves to the United States, becomes an American citizen, goes to American universities, works in American financial, for American financial corporations, and then gets hired by the Chinese to come work in China, where he does for 3 or 4 years. He then comes back to the United States and is hired to be the chief financial officer of a major investment firm in this country. Could there be any tie between Chinese intelligence and their desires and such a program? In my own work, it seems to me that one of the greatest threats we face is from China corrupting America's business and financial elites who see economic opportunity and put it before America's interests. If there is a single group committed to the success of the globalist project and what I previously referred to as the China dream, it is Wall Street. It is not surprising, although most disappointing, that the single most influential group opposed to America First national security and economic policies are the leaders of our financial community, who see money to be made by integrating the US and Chinese economies. All of which might lead you to ask, what does this mean for the United States? I said at the outset that we were at war with the People's Republic of China. We are in this war because Donald Trump had the temerity, what all of us would call courage, to declare to a candid world that he was going to put the interests of America first and end the economic war the PRC was waging against the United States. As I say, over the past decade, almost $6 trillion of American wealth have been stolen by the PRC through their theft of intellectual property. The United States, with the tech innovations coming out of Silicon Valley and Seattle, with entertainment coming out of Hollywood, with the medical research and development centers in New England and elsewhere, to name just a few industries, was witnessing theft at an unimaginable scale. Properly understood, this is the wealth and future wealth of the American people that the Chinese Communist Party was stealing. Now, ironically, this intellectual property was mostly being produced in the very places most hostile to President Trump politically: California, Washington, New York, Massachusetts. But President Trump staked his presidency on holding China to account because he knew that the United States, if it's producing anything, it's producing intellectual property. And he did it also, let me just say, because it was the right thing to do. Even more dangerous from the PRC's point of view, President Trump was well on his way to establishing in the public mind the nature of Chinese economic malfeasance, and that it ought to come to an end, that American policymakers ought to put America first, and that trade deals ought to benefit the American people rather than some other nation. In addition, President Trump combined his economic message with a strategic military buildup when he announced the creation of a new branch of our armed services, the United States Space Force. This meant the United States was not going to cede the strategic high ground of space to Communist China. From the Chinese point of view, no U.S. president had ever had the audacity to do such a thing. Not merely was President Trump not transferring technology to the PRC and making sure they would be punished for stealing our intellectual property, he was also rebuilding the American military in such a way as to challenge Communist China's growing military prowess. It was almost as if the Chinese Communist Party was no longer going to tolerate President Trump's America First policy, and so decided to take matters into their own hands. Mostly out of the public eye, on May 13th, 2019, so last year, the People's Republic of China, through their state media apparatus, Xinjiang News Agency, it's controlled by the CCP, declared a people's war against the United States. How many of you knew that they had declared a people's war? It was in response to President Trump's imposing tariffs because of their failure to negotiate in good faith on the theft of intellectual property and open their markets to U.S. goods. Their purpose, a year before the U.S. presidential elections, was to alert the Chinese people that war was coming, that its form would be based on their own communist total war tactics of information war, political war, economic war, and even quite possibly the use of military force. The second purpose of this declaration of a people's war was to warn the national security apparatus of the United States that whatever should follow ought to be seen in this light, lest anyone become alarmed and miscalculate their response. Now, we have to ask whether the use of the phrase "a people's war" was a throwaway line, just kind of like rhetoric. They were angry that day. Or did it mean something? Did it signal a fundamental shift in Chinese thinking? Now, I would not go so far as to say that the China virus that came from the Wuhan Institute of Virology was part of their People's War. But it did set into motion a radical reorientation of American society that appears almost entirely political in its nature. We know with certainty that after the virus began spreading in what appears to be the fall of 2019, the earliest dates where the virus is found trace back to November and December, that the Chinese closed down flights from Wuhan, which is in Hubei province, to the rest of China. They allowed, as we know, flights to go from Wuhan to both Europe and the United States. They knew with certainty that the virus would spread as viruses do. Did their People's War include the spread of COVID-19 as an intentional weapon against the United States? They locked down Wuhan and presented to the world the story of men in hazmat suits trying to contain the virus, stories of welding people's doors shut so that they could not leave their homes, stories of otherwise healthy people dying from the virus, and the general impression that we Americans were supposed to receive was that this was the most lethal and contagious virus we had ever seen. The United States and our Center for Disease Control, which has an office in China, asked to be let into Wuhan to investigate. To this very day, we have been denied access. The initial gene sequencing of the virus that we received, evidence from Dr. Fauci that China was being open and cooperative, that gene sequencing was wrong, a critical detail that made testing all the more difficult. Were these political decisions by the Chinese government? Was this part of their People's War? If you were the Chinese Communist Party and you were waging a People's War against Donald Trump, do you have an interest in the year he is to be reelected to have his countrymen believe they're in the middle of the deadliest pandemic in modern history? Do you have an interest in establishing in the public's mind that the only method for dealing with this virus is a complete lockdown for some indefinite period of time, the wearing of masks, the relinquishing of their personal freedoms so that Americans would not die by the millions? Might there be any consideration that this would have a political impact on President Trump and his America First policies? When challenged on all this, that same news service of the Chinese Communist Party, Xinhua News Agency, threatened Americans that they could plunge us into, quote, a mighty sea of coronavirus, since it was they, the Chinese, who controlled the supply chain for the active pharmaceutical ingredients used in the production of 90% of our medicines. This fact alone, that our medicines are made at this level in China and only China, some in India, of course, but not in the United States. This fact alone is a scandal of immense proportions that President Trump is today trying to correct. Although downplayed by the American media, it was significant that President Trump closed the borders to China. But no sooner had he done that, that same news agency, Xinhua News, and also the Global Times, another organ of the Chinese Communist Party, had a major push in the media, globally, but also here in the United States, to reopen the border. Again, they knew how contagious the virus was and spent money and resources to see if they couldn't get us to reopen our borders. Now, whether or not the Wuhan virus was a byproduct of biological weapons research or inadequate safeguards in a virology lab, it is the Chinese Communist Party that is to blame for its spread throughout the world, and it is criminal in its conduct to have kept the world in the dark about the nature of the pathogen. And it will be criminal if we do not hold them to account for what they have done to the United States. But you might say this is just part of the People's War, that they had warned us that such a thing could happen. But to talk this way in Washington is nearly unheard of. What else has happened in this People's War? It will come as a surprise to no one that Communist China uses its diplomatic mission in countries around the world as a base for industrial espionage of the kind I've described, and to conduct political and information warfare. In the United States, of course, it's no different. On July 24th of this year, so not that long ago, the U.S. State Department closed down the Chinese consulate in Houston because it served as a hub for Chinese Communist Party operatives who were engaging in the attempted theft of America's research into, among other things, the development of a vaccine for COVID-19. The U.S. closed the consulate also because, to quote a U.S. State Department official, quote, "Consulates are also bases of operation for fox hunt teams," he said. These are teams of agents sent from China here to coerce economic fugitives, meaning political rivals of President Xi, the Communist Party critics and refugees, coercing them, that is, to return to the PRC. Consulates enable the activities of those teams. This is the U.S. government talking now. Consulates also enable direct lobbying of state and local officials, as well as business people, to favor Chinese interests. And while that's to be expected by diplomats, when it takes a turn toward the coercive or the covert, that becomes a national security problem. End of quote. What does that mean? So the Chinese Communist Party sends non-diplomats, essentially intelligence operatives, to the United States to intimidate, lobby, and coerce Americans. Now, although not part of the acknowledgement of the closure, it was also widely believed that Chinese operatives in the Houston consulate may have given intelligence to Black Lives Matter and Antifa rioters during the riots in Houston as a way of demonstrating their solidarity with their communist allies. Again, we're talking about their people's war, and it's a well-accepted belief among communists that there is a middle-class aversion to violence. It would not be inconsistent for the CCP and their foot soldiers in BLM and Antifa to believe that America could be cowed into staying at home and keeping their heads down and supplicate themselves, literally and figuratively, to the notion that they are racist, deserve to be beaten, and have their way of life destroyed. Given their earlier pronouncements about unrestricted warfare and all that could entail, it would be unrealistic to dismiss such actions as outside the realm of possibility. Indeed, there is growing evidence that the Chinese Communist Party is employing a kind of united front strategy using their ideological allies, Black Lives Matter, Antifa, and without being too political, I would say the Democrat Party. It appears that funding for BLM and Antifa is coming from the communist Chinese-sponsored or affiliated groups called Liberation Road, the Freedom Road Socialist Organization, and the Chinese Progressive Association. If the Chinese are in a war, a people's war as they have proclaimed, we need to take them at their word and address this much more seriously as a nation than we have. Let me say in conclusion that in the middle of the civil war we find ourselves in today, it should not be a surprise that the enemies of freedom have taken the side of the communists and insurrectionists who mean to destroy our republic. It's not that difficult to see the demonic forces that have been unleashed upon the world and our country. But they do not understand the resilience and determination of the American people to defend our liberty and our constitutional order. As free men and women, let us be prepared to do our part to defend the American way of life. As children of light, let us be an example to our countrymen about all that is good about American civilization, now and in the days ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. We now have some time for Q&A. If you have a question, please make your way to one of the microphones in the side aisles. Question on the speaker's right.
One of the hottest stocks this past year has been Zoom, and I've heard that they've been coerced by China to close some accounts. How independent is Zoom from China?
They, like the rest of the country, are subject to that national intelligence law and are required under Chinese law to be able to give anything that the Chinese intelligence service asks for. We know that the source code of Zoom goes through, I believe, both Beijing and Shanghai. And so we would have to assume that if the Chinese government wanted to look into any Zoom call, that they legally would have the power to do so. And so that would not be a great option. Would they have an interest in being one of the controllers of Zoom during all this, given all the business that transpires across Zoom? Sure.
We have a question on the speaker's left.
Yes.
We're being prepped for chaos in the post-election period. If I were going to attack Taiwan, that's when I would do it. Is that plausible?
Well, there are some alarming moves that China is making vis-a-vis Taiwan. I would expect in this post-election period all sorts of chaos. And it looks here in this country like there's going to be riots before, during, and after the election. And during that period, we're going to focus an awful lot on keeping our own country together. It will be difficult during that to monitor what goes on in Taiwan. And so if anything could happen, that would be an opportune time for them. Doesn't mean it will happen. I think the Chinese would not be that interested in leading us to that kind of a war, but you never know. And I think the gist of what I'm trying to convey today is that these are people who are very determined. And if one of their goals was to take back Taiwan, they're going to try to do that, whether it's now or later. Good question.
Question on the speaker's right.
Thank you for the information that you've been sharing so far. And I'm not certain how prevalent this is, but an economics professor at Hillsdale had shared with me that there are multiple factions, but two of the major ones right now in the Chinese Communist Party are the Communist Youth League and the Shanghai faction. Do you have any insight into which one might be more ethical or more cooperative with the West?
No. I mean, this is the so-called united front of all these different groups within Communist China. I don't believe there's any scenario where, I don't think there's any useful scenario where we can try to decide whether there's good communists or bad communists in China. They're communists. They believe a certain ideology, they're ruthless about it, and I think they'll always have internal fighting within Communist China. But Xi Jinping has proven himself most determined to, hold power, and he's likely to do that. I think it operates, actually, China more like a mob. The Chinese Communist Party does too. They'll have all these different foot soldiers and all these different groups, but they're still the mob. They're an immoral group of people who are, totalitarians at heart. The real question is whether or not freedom could ever be brought to China. We know freedom is a very difficult thing. Republican government is a very difficult thing. And so China will develop as China develops. My essential point is we Americans need to make sure we're strong. I don't speak Chinese. I never had any interest in speaking Chinese. I don't even find Chinese society all that interesting. What I care about is America and defending this country and making sure that we're strong and free. That's the thing we have to care about.
We have a question on the speaker's left.
Yeah.
Yes, Mr. Kennedy. Recently, there has been an immunologist from Hong Kong who has escaped China and come to the U.S., who was very involved with working with the labs in Wuhan on the coronavirus, and has indicated, she's been highlighted several times on Fox News, has indicated that, well, not indicated, she has stated that it was intentional, that the coronavirus was released in order to infect the U.S. and many of its allies. Your thoughts?
I've seen her speak several times. Several of my colleagues have interviewed her. She seems pretty impressive, and her rendition of all that seems pretty authoritative. And so I would think she's useful in listening to, because she does describe some of the gain of function research China was doing. And so that gain of function research tries to take a virus and make it more lethal. We think that kind of research here in this country is dangerous, and so we outlaw it in this country. Dr. Fauci, it looks like, farmed that kind of research out to China to do. Itself utterly insane at some level. But her explanation of that sounds very plausible to me. But whether or not that's actually true or not, they certainly exported it around the world, knowing how lethal it was, or how contagious it was, and then, as we know, very lethal for people with certain comorbidities. So yes, no, I do think she's important and worth listening to, but even if she's totally wrong, the Chinese knew what they were doing in letting the virus escape.
Thank you very much for your comments, and it's very revealing what's going on in China, but we don't really know a lot. The Center for Security Policy and Gordon Chang have said that 40 million people have been moved from the Three Gorges Dam area, and that there's great worry the Three Gorges Dam may break, probably because of the pressure of a lot of rain plus bad design. Could you please comment?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very important thing. One of the members of the committee, Jeff Nyquist, has written about the grand solar minimums that are currently going on, and the fact that rain right now in China is at a historic level, and that amount of rain is putting an undue burden on their entire system for dealing with floods. If the Three Gorges Dam breaks, then that will be a horrific type of incident in China. And it looks to me very possible that just the kind of natural disaster that we could see because of these, a very large rain season in China could cause them very serious problems. And so Gordon Chang is absolutely right. I work with Frank Gaffney and Fred Fleitz at the Center for Security Policy on these things, and I think they're spot on the danger of all that.
Can you tell us a little bit about the effect of Falun Gong and their work to try to expose some of the things going on in communist China?
Yes, I think they're one of those groups that has managed to organize outside of communist China in order to explain just how the Chinese communists think. I was struck earlier by Dr. Arndt's explanation of totalitarianism and how, the kind of dramatic way communists or totalitarians think. The Epoch Times, for instance, which is a publication of Falun Gong-related people, has an explanation for what's going on today in China that I think is unrivaled. And they're doing some just outstanding work in explaining some of the evils of communist China that are not going to make their way into the mainstream media in any way, shape, or form. Largely, we Americans are living our lives. We're trying to sort through a whole host of things, including now the pandemic. We tend not to focus on things like China. They do, and they've done some great work on that. So that's a good question.
Yes, sir. Thank you for your presentation. I would like to know if you feel there's a relationship between George Soros' funding of Antifa as well as the cooperation with China.
I think Soros is and his Open Society Foundation have been funding all sorts of nefarious activities, including Antifa and BLM, and have been active in the American political process for some time. Soros has been funding the election of all these secretaries of state around the country and also these liberal, district attorneys. So Soros does mean to play in a very extensive way in American politics. Antifa, BLM, all of that has been part and parcel of that. Soros in China probably is a different matter. I don't think they work in concert, but both of them have at their heart the destruction of the United States. And so in that regard, they're a formidable challenge to us. And we in this country have not done an adequate job in seeing Soros or people like him as a threat to our freedom. Witness the fact that, if someone mentions Soros on Fox News, they'll be shouted down as Speaker Gingrich did, not that long ago. So yes, we're living in a very weird time in this country's history where things that should be open and transparent to the American people are not so transparent. And this is why I would say Hillsdale College is so important. The pursuit of the truth. What does it take to defend America, the American way of life, American civilization? What does that take? That is our job. That is the job of free people who care about those things that matter. And thank Hillsdale College for doing it better than anybody else.
Please join me in thanking Mr. Kennedy